pero sí les tengo que decir los de trabajo y el que me especializo. Entonces, sí, porque sí. Entonces, sí, no, ya. Tengo algunos añejos. Entonces, y les voy a decir, ya leí todo lo del ejercicio, el primer ejercicio que hicimos, y ya les voy a decir cómo nos fue. Porque quiero que a partir de esta clase del día de hoy, en ustedes va a estar cambiando la mentalidad de sus instituciones y de las mismas víctimas, la consideración que tenemos de ellas, ¿sí? Hay que cambiarnos el chip, porque nos pasa esto en la reforma. Como que no es tan fácil la parte cultural, todo lo del ámbito de aplicación de la ley, porque es una cuestión cultural. Entonces sí quiero que lo trabajemos, porque a partir de cómo veamos nosotros a las personas es conforme también pueden asumir las personas los roles, sin romper la base de derechos humanos y sin romper la base tampoco de ética profesional. El material que les voy a mostrar ahorita, hay cosas con las que me voy a ir muy rápido, no se las voy a leer, solamente se las voy a explicar, que tienen que ver sobre la implementación del nuevo sistema acusatorio adversarial a partir de la reforma. Ustedes lo leerán, se las voy a dar completa, el diagnóstico se los voy a dar en carpeta, ya ustedes leerán, pero van a ser las líneas generales. Lo que vamos a ver ahorita es un manual que trabaja, bueno, un taller que trabajamos en Argentina sobre alienación parental. Trae muchas de las cosas que tienen que ver con materia familiar, con materia penal, que tienen que ver con cuestiones forenses, que tienen que ver con cuestiones de género, violencia sexual contra niñas, niños y adolescentes. Pues es muy importante que manejemos esto porque viene ya para los códigos familiares, las leyes de familia, los códigos civiles de todos los estados de la República, y este tipo de argumentación, cuando se utiliza, anula la argumentación de violencia de género y violencia contra mujeres, y también la protección jurídica de niñas, niños y adolescentes. Por eso es que es tan importante, ¿sí? Entonces este video lo hizo la Fundación Mary Kay. Conste que también lo que consuma sus productos no es función. Les va a gustar mucho.
All over America, battered mothers are losing custody of their children when they file for divorce.
I naively thought to the future. Yes, digital.
Miren, toda esta base de teoría que les di en la mañana, que es entre jurídica, psicológica y todo, es la parte que a ustedes les va a ayudar a decodificar para el área jurídica cómo pueden llegar ustedes al área judicial, porque son las teóricas y los teóricos más influyentes que toman en consideración, sobre todo a nivel jurídico, porque, como les vuelvo a decir, en lo jurídico no tenemos teorías influyentes de mujeres o con perspectiva de género. Por eso les aparté las que se consideran no solamente en México, sino que están sirviendo para otros países. Me dicen si está bien el sonido y todo.
All over America, battered mothers are losing custody of their children when they file for divorce.
I naively thought that, if somebody molests their kid, I thought they'd just go to jail.
Even with a proven record, abusers are winning joint and sole custody.
To win custody of the kids over and against the mother's will is the ultimate victory, short of killing the kids.
I was just snatched up from my normal life, and all that anyone would tell me was that my mom was crazy and that she was going into a mental hospital.
In a case where those children have been abused or the mom has been abused, what's really best for children is for their safety to be made the top priority and for their healing.
It was just so scary. It was like, let's run away, let's get out of here,
because you know, like all this has happened. I mean, like what kind of person would take you away from your mom?
A third of the women in the U.S. will be victims of domestic violence. It will have devastating effects on their children. The Mary Kay Ash Charitable Foundation is proud to underwrite this program.
Sometimes there's one child in a family, and then everybody kind of agrees to abuse that poor child. Well, that wasn't true with me. My older brother was once almost beaten to death by my father. My sister was abused to a lesser degree, but she was quite terrified of my father. And as both my brother and sister would have agreed, because I was the youngest and the last one, and he had become much more of an alcoholic, I received the most brutal, the worst treatment.
He would fly into his rages just for no reason at all and start just behaving like an animal. And so I used to wonder if I were doing something wrong to provoke him to do that. And it took me years and years and years to realize that there was really nothing that I could do.
The fear, the best description, the best two words probably are constant fear. That's the first thing. It's constant. It's always eating away at you. And another description I would say is another description of the intimidation I would say is ruthlessness.
You started reaching the drawer for the revolver, and I remember going toward my sister, grabbing the knife out of her hand and putting it on the table and saying, "There." And I must have been maybe 11 years old at the time, 10, 11, 12, something like that. And then my dad, threw his hand from the drawer. So I know I've been asked quite often, did you ever call the police? Was it neighbors ever call the police? My dad was the police.
I had a pretty good life until I started, until my mom and my dad started to have arguments and over the whole custody thing.
We went to court for the first time December of '95. The attorney put a restraining order on him for his actions with the abuse. By January of '96, he told me that he was going to ruin me and destroy me. That's when he came back to tell me that he would be taking Sarah away from me.
When I was walking to school with one of my friends, and he came in his car and pulled over, and he tried to get me to talk to him, but I did, and he said, do you want to live with me? And I said, I don't know, but because I was afraid if I said no, then he would just keep asking questions, and whenever I saw him, he was always ask why was I shaking, because I used to start shaking in front of him, because it's scary, and I don't know what he's going to do.
The court said that my daughter spent too much time with me. They wanted Sarah to go into daycare because after school, they wanted to start getting her used to staying away from me.
It's very widespread, unfortunately, among abusers to use custody and visitation litigation as a continuing weapon of the abuse. And custody and visitation litigation can make it impossible, in one sense, for a woman ever to escape the abuse.
To win custody of the kids over and against the mother's will is the ultimate victory, short of killing the kids. It's the best way to hurt her and kick her down is to get her kids.
They said that my daughter was afraid of her dad. She didn't want to visit with him alone, and that was my doing. He was pulling her out of cars to visit with him, even when she didn't want to leave. And they said that I wasn't pushing her out of the car. Basically, they said that I should just bodily take her out of the car and drive away. And at that point, they got it in motion to start this parental alienation syndrome that they charged me with.
Parental alienation syndrome is a theory that was invented by a man named Richard Gardner. He said there is a syndrome called parental alienation whereby the custodial parent, who is usually the mother, is trying to alienate the children from the father. And she's doing it by raising these false abuse allegations.
If you have a child who is reluctant or refuses to visit a parent, or who makes complaints that the other parent is abusing them and refuses to go to visitation, the cause of that is the mother doing things to sabotage the relationship with the father.
Gardner's research has been thoroughly debunked by the American Psychological Association, and every other credible scientific expert that has looked at his work has said that there's no scientific validity to it. But they have acknowledged that nonetheless the courts are interpreting the facts in front of them in this light. And so if a mother comes into custody court and says, the father battered me and is putting the children at risk, or has even abused the children, the immediate response is, she's alienating. This is called parental alienation, Your Honor. She's just trying to alienate the children from the father. This is what mothers do. What we know statistically is that several studies have found that 75% of contested custody cases, 75% of those cases have a history of domestic violence. What that tells you is, if you're a judge and you're sitting on a contested custody docket, don't be surprised when abuse is brought up.
There are dozens and dozens who will all agree with me that this junk science called parental alienation syndrome has been responsible for so much harm. And yet I am aware every day of judges basing decisions on this, and psychologists using this as knowledge and making recommendations to judges because of this junk science, and it is appalling and responsible for so much harm.
I received something in the mail. I did not have an attorney at the time, and the court-appointed attorney for my daughter said that it was just going to be changing the visitation sites. They ordered me to come into court, and that's when they had already made their decision to charge me with parental alienation, and they took her away that day, saying that I was not to go to her school, pick her up, that her dad would be picking her up. 2 days later is when he told her that she wouldn't be coming back to me.
I was in the van with him, and I remember, like, can I go back to my mom? And because it was the day I was supposed to go back that day, and he's like, you're not going back. And I remember because we were going to Safeway, and I ran to the payphone down on 911, and I said, help me. But I had hung up, but I was too scared. I just wanted to run away. I remember kicking and screaming, and he's like, stop it, and he's really calm about it then. But I just like couldn't get over the fact that I couldn't go back to my mom. And I tried calling her, I tried going back to the house. Yes, and I remember I remember he let me go there just to say goodbye.
She knocked at the door, and she was just hysterical. Asking me to run away with her.
She's like, we couldn't, and I felt really sick, and I had to use the bathroom, and I was all scared, and like I just couldn't handle it. And I remember him coming up the stairs and knocking on the door and telling us to go, but it was just so scary because I was like, let's run away, let's get out of here, you know? Because, you know, like all this has happened. I mean, like, what kind of person would take you away from your mom?
When a woman goes to court seeking custody of her children and seeking to restrict the batterer's visitation with the children, she's not asking the court to protect her children. She is simply asking the court to permit her to protect her children. And what is happening is not that the court is failing to offer her protection. What is in fact happening is that the court is forbidding her to protect her children from a very well-known, very well-established danger.
Parents have a right to protect their children from abuse by the other parent. Protective fathers have a right to protect their children from abuse by the other parent. But it happens for certain reasons of social conditioning that the person that children are needing to be protected from is more often a father than a mother.
We walk into these courts, we think that they're going to do right by us, and we lose our children. And this is the best kept dirty little secret of our family court system. So once you're defeated, it's almost like a process to get back on your feet. And if you look at it that way, you really have to Take the emotion out of it. If you got the emotion in it, you're done. And then go through the process of how to rebuild it back to where it makes any type of sense. You have to get yourself up and then fight it, because it is a battle.
Cases where the mother alleges battering and risk to children, how many of those cases are being awarded custody to fathers? And what the studies are showing is roughly 2/3 award joint or sole custody to fathers who are accused or adjudicated of battering.
There is a societal misconception that mothers are very heavily favored in custody and visitation litigation over fathers, and that somehow will take care of the needs of mothers who need to protect their children from a battering or sexually abusive father. In fact, the maternal preference went out more than 20 years ago, and the research studies that we have had in most recent years not only show that the maternal preference has disappeared, but in fact that fathers now have preference for custody.
When we were a family, he picked on my mom, and now he has no one else but me, and he won't pick on his girlfriends. So, and I'm the only one that's there.
Well, our grandmother believed me, but the rest of the world thought he was just this very respectable, perfect person who was this big lawyer, and he was in this club, and he went to church every week and everything, and to everybody else thought he was this perfect person with a perfect family that was really nice, and he was nice to his family and everything.
Much more often than not, an abuser is someone who comes off well when he's talking to people outside the family. He knows how to present himself as a calm, reasonable person. Often he's actually quite skilled at presenting himself as a victim of an unreasonable or vindictive or hysterical woman.
My ex-husband is extremely violent. When he becomes angry, he can't check his anger. You can see anger come over him physically. He becomes red, his entire demeanor changes. If you don't get away physically, you will be hit.
There would be no telling when he would just fly into a rage and start breaking things and hitting people. So we had to be very, very quiet and stay out of his way, do whatever he said, and try to, live on the fringes without provoking him too much.
If he found out that the kids or I had any enthusiasm or excitement about participating in anything, or that we might be having friends or any kind of normal life, he would take steps to cut that off.
One of the things that was my dad's favorite to do was to kill the pets or hurt the pets or threaten to kill the pets. He did that a lot.
I remember one day coming home from school, and I went upstairs, and there was a rabbit, one of our rabbits, Tibber, lying on the floor, and I went over to him, and his neck was broken. And I don't really think rabbits could break their necks all by themselves.
I met him at a party, and it turned out that we had all the same friends. I really thought he was fine, and I married him 6 months after that, and had Catherine 9 months later, and had to leave when she was 10 months old because, he was even hurting the baby. So we were separated for 2 years, and during that time, he was attempting to get custody of Catherine, the baby that he hated. And he told me that I would have to come back or, she would be hurt. So we remarried. When people ask me about that now, they think that sounds absolutely insane. Why would you remarry someone who was a
dangerous person and has threatened to kill you and harmed your baby and everything else. But if you were in the situation, you would understand that that was the safest choice that I could make.
Once I got the strength to stop the battery, then it stopped. But it seems like they take their victim into court, and the battery actually amplifies.
The custody battle started where custody slowly got changed to where there was set times when we had to see our dad.
I had custody for about 5 years. In the process, in those 5 years, we went through 2 to 3 full psychological evaluations.
In family court, the judge will appoint a custody evaluator, a psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker, to conduct an investigation and make recommendations to the court.
None of the tests have been validated for use in the domestic violence context. Oftentimes, batterers test very normal. In fact, most of the time, batterers test normal. The tests actually tend to make the victim look pathological, a little bit off balance, because the tests do not assess for battery.
More and more time was given to my dad, even though me and my brother were against everything about that. We wrote letters, talked to our attorneys.
The idea is that children cannot speak for themselves in court, and that you need an adult who essentially is representing the child or the child's best interests to the court. Because again, the idea is that neither parent is speaking for the children, they're speaking for themselves. Each state has its own laws about who can be appointed. In my state, you have to be a lawyer, but in some states you don't. And the idea is that they're appointed to represent the child, but there's a lot of confusion and ambiguity in, I think, most states about what that really means. In some states, that means that they speak for the child, and they're actually a voice for the child. And more often, I think that's perceived as speaking for what the guardian himself thinks is the child's best interests.
The child's lawyer has been documented by a number of people who've studied this issue to be perhaps the greatest impediment to a child being protected in the system, because they don't act like lawyers. They don't talk to the kids, they don't find out the facts, they don't investigate, they just go off and write a report to the court based on some misguided principles.
My own attorney yelled at me. He yelled at me and called me a liar, saying, when I finally think of something that is truthful and not what my mother's telling me, to call him.
There's ex parte hearings. I had 60 of them in my case, where you had a 24-hour notice to answer the documents that you had gotten served 12 or 14 hours before.
Ex parte means on behalf of one party. In a court proceeding, the judge, in order for the judge to be fair and impartial, is prohibited by judicial ethics from accepting information or contacts from just one side.
You can informally call the judge's chambers if you're just trying to find out if they're going to issue a ruling on something that you've already filed, or when are they going to do that, or can we postpone the next hearing, that kind of thing. But what is not considered appropriate is to go before a judge and allege new material and raise new legal issues and new factual issues without notifying the other side.
Now, for some reason, the system, although it's not by anybody saying this is how it should happen, the system in family court in these cases that we're talking about are very frequently the product of ex parte communications.
I had no problem with visitation with my ex, but every time they went for visitation for 2 weeks, there was always an ex parte, which extended the visitation to 3 to 4 months. And then when my sons came back, unfortunately then the mother gets the brunt of not protecting them, and you get hammered pretty heavily back by your children.
You don't know what you're supposed to count on because you don't know what the judge heard, what the judge believes before you get to court. At least if things are presented in open court, you can respond. So this ex parte communication that occurs in family court in these cases is devastating.
I was very fortunate that the week before my children were taken away from me, that I had an advocate approach me. And to be truthful, I thought she was playing crazy because I still hadn't understood the whole picture of what was going on. And she flat told me, she goes, they're going to take your children away. They're going to do it in the most harmful way. They're going to mock you in court. And they're going to do everything they can to make you come unglued. And I looked at the psychiatrist and I said, you know, I just was courteous to her because she was giving me free time. But to this day, I thank the Lord for her talking to me, because exactly what she told me was going to happen happened in court that day. An ex-parte hearing, my boys were crying and hanging on to me, being told and torn off of me, and said they were going to have to live in Indiana because their mother was alienating them from their father.
I was really touched by all this wonderful, all of you wonderful ladies, but again, we're all in the same boat here. And I just want to say, I know it's very hard for all of us, but first of all, we have to deal with how am I going to translate my emotional status. I mean, here you're going to talk about emotions to your child. How are you going to translate this, what all these emotions you have? And then we all have our cultural backgrounds. So are you going to be screaming? Are you going to be standing? How is that going to be looked at? Like earlier it was said, you know, men can't just be men, and you know, people will attend to that. Oh, he's upset. Well, women, when we go and express our anger, we are crazy, but all the other names I can't think of it. So he told me once, he made me and he will unmake me. And this is what's going on with him, that he has his belief, this poor African woman that he brought her, got education, is doing so well, academically, professionally, financially, and relationship-wise, that it's to him, it's not possible. And he always feels he has to unmake me. To a certain extent, yeah, taking my child away from me for this period of time and would animate any woman.
My father has a way of making important people in custody believing him that he is a good father, that he has never done anything wrong, and I'm always crazy and abusive. He cries during the hearing, and if you ever see a 6'3" white grown man cry in front of you, you think, what a horrible teenager he must have, you know, that poor guy. And he plays it to the full extent. He's manipulative and he knows what he's doing. He's been doing it for 15 years.
We've been in legal custody since she was 5 months old. My mother once told me, you know, when I was so tired and I wanted to give up, she says, remember chickens, you go after the chickens' babies, the little chicks, the mother chicken will come after you and just literally attack you. And she said, you're stronger than a chicken.
My father would check me over every time I walked into his house from my mother's. If there's any mark on my body, he'd go to the courthouse and he'd document that as an abuse. One time when I was 3 or 4, I'm always ironing clothes and I stepped on an iron and burned my ankle. He said my mother was deliberately burning me. I was taken away from my mother and I was sent to live with my father without any contact with my mom for 3 years. During those years, my dad used to slander my mother frequently, telling me she was a drug user, you know, she ran off to Africa with a new husband, she has a new family now, she doesn't want to come back. You know, she's a whore, she doesn't want me anymore, she abandoned me, you know, she abused me so much that she, you know, that if I ever saw her, she'd kill me. What he was doing to my mother and me was beyond my comprehension at the time, so I thought he was this great guy, and I had never even fathomed that he would lie to me, so part of me, you know, really knew it wasn't true, and she was my mom and she'd never done this, and the other part of me was like, well, this is my dad, he would never lie to me.
Since we have research showing that children's relationship with their mother is the #1 factor in how resilient they're going to be to the experiences of having witnessed domestic violence, we know that the long-term harm to children from having a father damaging, destroying their relationship with their mother is potentially huge.
At the end of 3 years, I went to a therapist who suggested that I go start reunification with my mother. At first, I was really adamant I did not want to do it. I was like, you know, she's forgotten about me all these 3 years, you know, she didn't want me, she ran off, and I just, you know, spilling out everything my dad had been, you know, brainwashing me through the past 3 years. But then after I met her and through,
months and months of visitation, and finally I realized she's not the person he's painted her to be. He must be lying, and I put two and two together. He was just this wonderful attorney there, not a father, no emotions. And sees some objects that he has to get back that was taken from him. I then requested to, maybe the end of 8th grade year, because, I'd be going on to high school, I would move with her. Ever since then, we started becoming, more hostile, more, I don't know, more resentful of me. The first time she was 13, she was put in a foster home by her dad, voluntary basis. How many teenagers would want to say, the first time I ever turned my teenage year, I was put in foster home? After 10 months, he didn't enjoy the financial burden it had to keep me in voluntary foster care, so we struck a deal. He said, you come stay the last 2 months of 8th grade with me, and then I'll let you go live with your mom. So, the day before I'm supposed to go with my mom and I'm packing, my dad tells me, oh, change of plans, you're not going home. He's like, you know what, you treat my wife, you treat me, and I don't like you because you did, so I'm not going to allow you to go back home.
Emotional abuse is the systematic diminishment of a child. It is never an event. It is a pattern of behavior. It is a sequence of events. Again, it's never a single event. And it has a goal. Its goal is to diminish the self-concept of the child, that the child feels unworthy of friendship, unworthy of respect, unworthy of a child's birthright, and that is to be protected, to be loved. The child is made to feel responsible for the abuse.
The one thing I think that stayed with me as a child and through most of my adult life was the fact that I never talked about it, never shared it, and I think it added to a lot of my problems. Shyness, very low self-esteem, a lot of times feeling whatever was going wrong was my fault. All these things I realized later on were all related to the fact that I was harboring all these emotions that I never allowed anybody to share with me.
I know that there are organizations who are out there and advocates who are supporting each other. I'm more action-oriented, and I can't settle down, and it's the only way I think that I can do to find healing. Even though you can't be healed until you're on the other side of the fence, it's a way of keeping me going, is doing something. Mothers are never prepared for their children to disclose sexual abuse. And when my children disclosed, I didn't want to believe it, but I didn't know what to do either. And I was in the midst of a divorce, and the children had only that 1 week begun to see their father alone when we had separated, and that's when they came home, and one of them was in serious pain, and she was quite inflamed in her vaginal area. And so when you start going through the battles, it's number one, you don't know what to do. I turned to my attorney and I was given very, very bad advice. I turned to the courts through my attorney, and I found that the more my children disclosed, the more the court didn't want to believe that my children had been abused. They believed their father instead, and they took the children away from me totally. It's been 4 years and 3 months since I've even seen my children.
There is always the dilemma as to whether this is child abuse is an actual event as being reported by the mother. So on the one hand, if the mother allows it, they'll say, well, she is a neglectful mother, and take the child away because you neglected to protect. And on the other hand, all too often, The mother says, especially after a divorce, a separation or a divorce, where the mother is now able to see things that she didn't realize that were going on, like child sexual abuse, on behalf of the perpetrated by the ex-husband. Now she's able to see these symptoms.
Well, clearly my daughter has been abused, and it's all documented, and she wrote a lot of letters to the judge by herself about abuse, and the judge, actually that made the judge very upset, and the judge thought that my daughter directly challenged him. So he not only gave the sole custody to my ex-husband, also put me back to supervise the visitation 4 hours every other, once a month. And after that, I just cut, and I just couldn't hold together, even though I know I have all the truth, and but just too overwhelming.
My sister has been extremely heartbroken over this matter. The fact that she's been taken away from her family. She's always been there to see the conflict between my parents. She's always been there to see the abuse that my father has really subjected his family to. So she's always been there first-handedly seeing what's going on. It's tragic, I would say, that she is forced to go live with the same person she suffered at the hands of.
I told my daughter that she was going to stay with Dad and only come back on the weekend to see Mom and her brother, and she was just devastated. And she also, at that point, revealed to her therapist that her father molested her for probably 4 or 5 years. He'd been tap her every night, and she said that's why did that happen for all these years. So I called CPS, and the therapist of my daughter called CPS. I filed a report to the police department. Then we filed a reconsideration with this new evidence.
And if he is in fact molesting her, and she's having all this upset, and she's pulling out of her eyebrows, and she doesn't know what to do because she's lived with him in the past and has seen his violence, that when he tells her he's going to be getting custody of her, she finally reveals what he has been doing to her. And the response to that is for her to be given to him and completely separated from her mother, completely. Birthday, Christmas, no contact whatsoever, to be isolated from her brother. And his motivation is clear. He has got to keep her quiet, and that's what this is all about.
There is no change of circumstances presented in the current motion. In effect, this is a second bite of the apple.
Commissioner basically said the sexual abuse allegation is suspicious because of time-wise, and why did the child review this before?
The motion is denied.
There are quite a number of cases in which a battery man also sexually abuses children. There's a high overlap between domestic violence perpetration and incest perpetration, statistically speaking. And I've seen the anguish of mothers whose children are being sexually abused and where the court refused to permit her to protect her children.
My daughter called me the first night after she went to her father's house. She talked to me 5 times on her cellular phone.
young people that we have here who have lived exposed to the behavior of batterers, who know firsthand what happens to children from having a batterer present in the home. Go ahead.
My name is Jeff Hogerson. I'm with the Courageous Kids Network. It's part of the California Protective Parents Association. And I know many of you are in this battle. Many of you maybe might be therapists or whatever. But your kids, if they need somebody to talk to, I know when we were going through this, before we were all rescued, we were able to talk to each other, and it was the most helpful thing to know that another kid was going through the same thing.
The room I slept in was directly across from my sister's, and he would go in there and spend like, I don't know, well into the night. I was young, but I had a concept of time, and I knew it was at least like 3 hours that he would be in there. And I couldn't imagine what else he'd be doing other than what I'd heard from the interviews, because my sisters had said, that's exactly when it happened. And I was so young, there's nothing I was going to do. I was so afraid to walk into the other room and see that he was, touching them and stuff. It's the most helpless feeling.
About a year, maybe a year and a half after we split up in 1993, my oldest daughter, who was about 5 then, started acting out sexually on her younger sister. And that went on for quite a while. I didn't know what was going on, but something didn't seem right. And so eventually, my oldest daughter started actually disclosing things like that her father was getting in the shower with her and sleeping with her, and she didn't want him to, but she couldn't make him stop. First of all, when my daughters disclosed that their father was molesting them, my oldest daughter, who was 7 at the time, described him showing her child pornography and forcing her to reenact what was in the pictures. She described being raped, sodomized, and she described him kneeling over her head, and she said it felt like something pokey in my throat. So I knew she was telling the truth, because no 7-year-old child could possibly conceive of that position and could not possibly conceive of what that would feel like. When she had a sexual assault examination at UC Davis Medical Center, it was determined that she had 3 old healed wounds and 1 fresh wound and a damaged hymen. So my ex was not indicted. I mean, he wasn't prosecuted for the molest, and everything got dealt with in family court.
It began with the evaluator, who made a report that said that my sisters were lying about my dad molesting them, and it was because of parent alienation syndrome. And so he wrote the report to the court, and they believed it because he was hired by them. And then it kept going with the lawyer who, in court, withheld all the evidence of molest.
I naively thought that, if somebody molests their kid, I thought they'd just go to jail. That was my impression. So I was so taken off guard by what was going on. It was like being in the twilight zone.
Mothers who allege abuse are automatically up against this defense that actually they're alienators. Then what happens is when the evaluator is brought in, or the guardian ad litem, everyone is busy investigating her for alienating. And they're looking at everything she does or says and casting it in this light of she's an alienator, she's trying to alienate the kids. And they're totally distracted from assessing whether the father is actually a risk and abuser to the children and the mother.
The court-appointed psychologist who testified to this parent alienation syndrome had never read the medical reports, he never read the police reports, he never even interviewed my children about abuse.
When an advocate raises child sexual abuse as a claim or a concern, it tends to enrage courts and evaluators and neutrals. It's the equivalent of throwing a bombshell into the courtroom. That's how it's received. It's seen as outrageous and extreme, and you're going to have to meet an extremely high burden of proof to persuade the court that it's true.
It seems to me that the whole system couldn't have cared less about my kids. They were focusing not on my kids, they were focusing on me. I became this target, and my kids' interests were completely, thrown to the side after that.
I was, I think, 7.5 or 8. I was put in the custody of my dad. I was just snatched up from my normal life, put into an alternate one. I didn't get to talk to my mom. I didn't get to go back home and get any of my stuff. And all that anyone would tell me was that my mom was crazy and that she was going into the mental hospital. We didn't see our mom for probably 2 or 3 months, I think it was. And then with the therapist, we went into a room with my mom there, and walking into that room and seeing her there was the most awkward experience I've ever had in my life. Because the therapist had told us not to hug her or kiss her or talk to her about what was going on in her life, so that didn't leave very many options for what to say or do. So walking in there, seeing her and seeing her so upset, and just being so upset myself that, she was so close yet so far.
And what happens, Mom? You have support that you don't even know of. You have government agencies, you have senators, you have state reps. And if you go to them and you take your stories and you document your stories and you go to them, you will find people that will help you. You gotta support each other, you gotta document your stories and help each other. And it's a battle every day. And don't take no. No is not no. No is on. Go again.
This evaluator that was at the bottom of all this, I filed a complaint against him with the Medical Board of California. He was actually charged by the State Attorney General with gross negligence for refusing to investigate the sexual abuse and for giving incompetent testimony to the court, and he pled no contest to the charges. I filed a complaint against the judge, and after a 3.5-year investigation, the State Commission on Judicial Performance substantiated his misconduct in the case, and he was disciplined. The State Victims' Compensation and Government Claims Board did a new investigation, came back and said there was at least a preponderance of evidence that my daughters were molested by their father, and so basically I've won the case on the state level, unfortunately, and new laws were created as a direct result of my case and 2 other cases just like it. And I even had the lawyer from the Assembly Judiciary Committee come to court in 2000 and say, we used the facts of this case to create this law. And the court said, oh well, since the law doesn't say it's retroactive, we're just going to say that it doesn't apply.
It's nothing we can do. The Judicial Committee is all hung up, it's all pulled up by the power of the court system. How many complaints against these judges? Boxes and boxes and letters from all women. And then I found out that one judge who is sitting on my custody has 3 boxes of complaints against him.
We need to create meaningful systems of judicial accountability. That's a complex question. But judges who deal with family law proceedings generally have no accountability for their actions. There are very few battered mothers who are in a position to appeal. In some cases where they can appeal, we actually get very good responses from appeals courts. That's one of the bright spots in some cases.
The costs of litigating a case like this are staggering, because if you are a battered mother and you lose at the trial level and you want to appeal, the cost of appeals are huge. Typically, $50,000 is low to pay for an appeal.
We may need to look to jury trial for custody or some other way of making custody not up to just the particular opinion of the judge.
This whole area of abuse, both adult abuse and particularly child abuse, is very fraught. It's excruciatingly painful material, and it's something that no one wants to believe. And people who work in the field struggle with burnout and what we call secondary traumatic stress, which is what happens when you're exposed to traumatic material over and over and over, and you get either numbed by it or overly reactive to it. You can't cope well with it because it's traumatizing to hear about it. So I think some of what goes on in courts is they're hearing about it every day, and they're doing what they can to cope with that. And some of the rulings that they issue and the reactions that they have to the parties are their ways of coping. They're not good for the kids, in my view, and they're not constructive, but it's their attempt to cope with the intolerableness of this material.
We have a belief as a society that when divorces happen, what's best for children is to have the most extensive possible relationship post-separation with both their mother and their father. And that's true in a typical divorce. That's not true in a divorce with a man that's a batterer or who's a sexual abuser. In a case where those children have been abused or the mom has been abused, what's really best for children is for their safety to be made the top priority and for their healing to be made the top priority.
I think I've given up. I've thrown in the towel. All I could do was send him miscellaneous emails that I loved him. I exhausted $98,000 of every drop of money, my brother, my sister, my mother, and anything that we had into lawyers to protect them. The next thing I know is a year had gone by, and I think I went into more of a vegetated state. Go to work, come home, go to work.
I was out in California on a vacation, and I knew that this was now or never, because no one was going to help me, only I could help myself. I was leaving my grandparents' house, saying that I was going to return a video game that I borrowed with my friend. From there, I went over to another friend's house and stayed there for a while. I went from friends to friends, just as everybody can handle me, staying sometimes a few days, sometimes a few weeks. The boys being found.
I actually didn't want to think about my sons. It was too hard. It pulled you down to a point you couldn't get up the next morning. I said, you know, I have to get up, I have to go to work, because someday my sons are going to come home. And that's when I received a letter in the mailbox. It was from Randall. He had made a decision of his own to run away. But my first expression was, oh my Lord, he's run away, he's out on the streets. But in this letter he stated that he was with a very good Christian family and he was safe.
After about a year and a half, my court-appointed attorney was assigned as a judge to family court. With this I saw an opening and I started looking for my own attorney. After a little while, I finally found a good attorney that I thought I could trust, and that was just the best thing that ever could happen for me.
You all of a sudden knew it was going to come out on the other side. That he had an attorney that would talk to him and believe him. And that she actually said those magical words, your son's going to come home.
Finally found a really good attorney, and that was the most amazing thing when I called her up and she said, what do you want? First thing she said, what do you want? Not, I think this is what's good for you. I was like, I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. I was like, okay, this is not normal. So I told her, this is what I want. And you can tell I'm not coming out hiding until these things are done. And it was amazing how fast that she got things done. She was up there, up at the court, filing stuff in the judge's face, saying, this kid is not coming home until this happens. And finally, they caved.
We need to drop the best interests of the child standard for custody determinations. It's not a good standard because you can hardly ever find two people in the country who will agree about what the best interests of the child are. So the use of the best interests of the child standard is actually turning family law proceedings over to prejudice.
I always, when I was a juvenile court judge, I would have the child in chambers. I would have the lawyers there, of course, lawyers on each side, and I would question the child and let the child express their wishes. It should be taken into the total situation.
A year before I turned 18, I just decided to leave my dad's house because nobody would listen to me. My lawyer, who was the same one I'd had all along, would not listen to me.
I've been trying to get Jeff some counseling for his depression as a result of the years of emotional abuse and neglect in his dad's house. And I fought in the courts to try to get him some counseling, and his dad, because his dad had legal custody, he refused. He fought against it. And he basically has always been given anything he ever wants in court. So Jeff wasn't able to get counseling. So after he came to live with me as soon as he was 18, and his dad didn't have any control over him anymore, legal control, then I helped him to get into some counseling. And my daughters are still living with their dad.
They can't tell the truth even. They have to pretend like everything's okay. I mean, I see them, they visit every other weekend, and my relationship with them is, I can't say I have a relationship with them. But now I'm still in a battle, only for my sisters. I know they don't appreciate what I'm doing. They are not happy with me being here right now. But someday they'll understand that this is the only way they can lead.
Sarah has been court ordered to return to her dad. She has decided not to do that. She's staying at an undisclosed place. She is going to her high school. Her dad has spoken to the principal, and the principal has decided to protect Sarah against him, seeing his outbursts and rages in the principal's office, and she's not allowed to live with me.
I don't think he loves me. I don't think my dad loves me. I don't think he loves me because he wouldn't have done all like this and try to like bribe me with money. Money is not a good way of showing love. He's never considered taking me out or anywhere except on vacation with one of his girlfriends. He's always talked about money and about how bad my mom is. That's not how a father should talk about a mother when a child is there, and talk about how she's done all this bad stuff to him and how he's been the perfect dad. And I mean, how can you be perfect when you hurt someone so bad that it's like ruins you and it makes you feel like you want to die?
I think that your children are your greatest allies. If you talk to them and you reach out to them, they'll be more than willing to fight for you. I don't have to be connected to my mother, I don't have to talk to my mother, but I know as long as she's alive with the breath of her body, she'll be fighting for me, and I want to reciprocate that for her. And I think that if you get your children involved, it'll be a lot easier for both of you, because you'll have each other for support, and you'll have each other as allies in a fight to get something you both want.
If you or someone you know needs help, call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, 1-800-799-7233.
Bueno, después de ver esto, ¿por qué es importante para nosotros saber de este tema? Como ustedes estuvieron hablando en la mañana, tenemos casos en materia familiar que pasan a materia penal. Que bueno, estos son los argumentos. Esto de la alienación parental está muy fuerte, ya hay códigos de familia, ya hay códigos civiles y leyes que se están creando, incluso en algunos estados se está creando el delito. ¿Para qué? Para llevar a prisión a las mujeres, ¿sí? Porque esto tiene nombre y esto es específico para las mujeres, para quitar guardia y custodia. Y ahorita, ¿por qué creen que ha tenido tanto éxito la película de Derbez? Si ya la vieron. Porque trata un tema así, y ahí la madre es la mujer. Entonces incluso le dice a Victoria Rufo, dice, pues es mi caso como más o menos parecido, ¿sí? Cuando no toman en cuenta todas las circunstancias del caso de él. Entonces, si nos damos cuenta, exactamente, esta parte de cómo se construyen las leyes de víctimas tiene mucho que ver no solo con la materia penal, tiene que ver con diferentes materias. Pero ¿hacia dónde vamos nosotros? Miren, para la implementación de este nuevo sistema, se crea toda una política pública de implementación homogénea en todo el país para la implementación de este sistema acusatorio adversarial que Chihuahua y Nuevo León ya habían empezado desde hace mucho tiempo. Hay toda una política y una planeación, no me quiero detener mucho, y esto está, la CETEC, que es un organismo, ahorita les digo el nombre completo, que está encargada de su implementación. Tiene estrategias en la implementación de la reforma, planeación para la implementación del sistema, y un modelo para implementar, diagnosticar, estratificar diseños, programas, proyectos y seguimientos. Pero les quiero mostrar algo rápidamente. Con este solo esquema les muestro la problemática que tiene este modelo. Etapas de implementación de la reforma. Inicia la implementación. Seguimos con la planeación, la entrada de vigencia, la operación parcial y la operación total. Estamos a 2 años y medio de la implementación de este nuevo sistema. Si les muestro yo este esquema, ¿qué problemática le encuentran a este esquema? A ver, digan. ¿Vale? Exactamente, principio básico para cualquier persona racional. Para poder implementar necesito antes planear, y para planear necesito tener diagnóstico, ¿sí o no? Y ya vimos ahorita, si no podemos acceder a las estadísticas, como les decía yo en la mañana, es la hora en que estoy esperando desde hace 3 meses mis estadísticas para las personas adultas mayores, tipo de delito y género, pues ya se imaginarán cómo estoy implementando. ¿Cómo estoy implementando esto yo en nuestro país? Vean, la Secretaría, que es la CETEC, es la Secretaría Técnica del Consejo de Coordinación para la Implementación del Sistema de Justicia Penal 2009-2012. Ahora les doy otro dato. Para implementar este sistema en todo el país, desde que del 2008 al 2013, de mayo del 2013, solamente había 1,000 personas, 938 personas certificadas para este nuevo sistema. En uno de los estados que he estado trabajando, que es el estado de Veracruz, solamente había 3 personas certificadas para todo el estado. Ahorita que hicieron una campaña en todas las universidades y todo para certificar masivamente. ¿Por qué? Porque para certificar necesito yo gente que certifique, que esté certificada para implementar. Entonces ahorita están haciendo esto masivamente, pero fíjense, hasta el año 2012, el mes de septiembre, todo lo que ven en azul son los códigos penales vigentes, lo que está en verde son los códigos publicados sin entrar en vigencia, y lo que está aquí como códigos presentados en el Congreso están en amarillo. ¿Se dan cuenta cuántos están todavía pendientes? ¿Por qué? Porque eso también depende de voluntades políticas. ¿Sí? Estado de México, ustedes van a ver. Ustedes dicen ahí, hasta septiembre del 2012, código vigente de procedimientos penales. Pero ojo, recuerden que tenemos en la Agenda Nacional el Código Penal Único, que puede echar atrás todo esto, ¿sí? Sin perspectiva de género. Todos los proyectos que yo he visto no tienen perspectiva de género, ninguno de los códigos procesales. Ahora, vamos a ver esto, 2011 y 2012, vean, casi 17 leyes que se tocan. Ustedes ven alguna ley que tiene que ver con igualdad de mujeres y hombres, alguna ley general de acceso de las mujeres a una vida libre de violencia, no, ni la de niños, niñas y adolescentes, y son leyes que tenemos que tocar a la par, que tenemos que tocar todas las leyes penales. ¿Por qué? Porque como lo empezamos a ver en la mañana, tiene mucho de injerencia. Lo que se ha ejercido en cuanto a presupuestos, vean, 2010, 11, 12, que son cantidades estratosféricas, una ley puede estar implementándose, simplemente una ley, un código sobre 350,000 pesos. Ahora, a nivel nacional hay la creación de una ley fundamental penal, aparte del Código Penal Único, que va a ser como un eje directriz en todo el país. ¿Qué va a pasar con esto? Miren, el problema es que estamos, no solamente la ley es la que nos va a servir, porque tenemos delito de feminicidios, y se los vuelvo a decir, se han incrementado los feminicidios. Tenemos leyes de niñas, niños y adolescentes, se han incrementado la violencia contra los niños a nivel físico y las muertes de niñas, niños y adolescentes, y nos los están privando de la vida en sus casas, ¿sí? Eso es lo más grave de todo. ¿Por qué? Porque las encuestas de victimización nos dicen que no los dejamos salir a jugar por miedo a que les pase algo. ¿Y de dónde nos llegan lesionados o heridos los niños? De las casas. Y bueno, ya saben que siempre, bueno, sí, los niños, niñas son traviesos, pero no tienen nada que ver. ¿Qué hizo la CETEC y la Secretaría de Gobernación para implementar las leyes de víctimas? Hizo este estudio que también se los incluyo en el disco para el final del curso, en donde es el estudio sobre garantías y derechos procesales de las víctimas, en donde hace todo un análisis de las leyes de víctimas, las estrategias que hay que hacer, que hay que garantizarles, que hay que buscar. Bueno, habla de los secuestros, de lo que es las estadísticas referentes a las encuestas de victimización. Y vean esta caricatura ilustra lo del sistema de justicia, lo que hacemos en la mañana. La roban, pide ayuda, va la policía, va corriendo todo el sistema para ver a la persona que cometió el delito, y dice la víctima, oye, se olvidaron de mí. Ella se queda atrás, o sea, ella va corriendo atrás de todo el sistema para que le apliquen justicia, y dice, bueno, entonces la víctima solamente la pasa de lado, ¿no? Estados o ordenamientos en toda la República comparativos en atención a víctimas. No lo integran en texto, y sí lo integran en texto. Como les comentaba, ustedes están integrados en texto. Recuerden que ustedes fueron el primer estado en el mundo en que tuvo la primera ley de víctimas. Nombres de las leyes, bueno, ustedes sí tienen ley de víctimas. Conclusiones y propuestas, bueno, la creación de centros de atención con patrimonio propio, centros existentes de actualidad que dependen de las procuradurías, también en las comisiones de derechos humanos tenemos áreas de atención a víctimas, en institutos de las mujeres, los centros de justicia para mujeres que dependen de CEGOP, o sea, hay toda una normatividad. Pero ¿qué pasa en esto? Miren, lo grave de esto y lo preocupante es que muchas veces no le preguntamos a las víctimas lo que necesitan. Ustedes ahorita que vieron el video, cuando le dicen al niño, ¿y tú qué quieres? Y se queda así como pasmado, ¿de qué quiero? ¿De qué? Lo que les dije que pasa en El Salvador, cuando le preguntan a la víctima, hable, y no habla, dice, pero le dimos la oportunidad de hablar, le dije, sí, pero no lo empoderaste, no tienes todo un proceso terapéutico, no le explicas. Pues cuando me dicen, hable, ¿qué le digo? Porque además tienen miedo de decir algo que pueda perjudicar su caso. Entonces, si yo no le digo qué derechos tiene, qué deberes tiene, ¿qué es lo que voy a provocar? Que no participe. Y no porque no quiera participar, sino porque no sabe. Hay, por ejemplo, compañeras y compañeros que les digo, sobre todo en derecho, ahora hay leyes, por decirles, leyes de víctimas como la del Distrito Federal, en donde designa abogadas y abogados victimales. O les puedo decir, con cédula y título como victimólogos, somos 28. O sea, porque para eso necesitamos muchas veces cédula y título, más aparte de lo del derecho, y especializarnos ya sea en mujeres, en niños, niñas, y depende de la circunstancia. ¿Por qué? Porque ahorita nos vamos a dar cuenta que quieren que hagamos de todo. A mí me dicen trata, le dije, perdónenme, pero trata es una visión internacional, y yo tengo que estudiar una maestría. Y dice, ¿usted la pasa estudiando? Le dije, sí, y voy a seguir estudiando porque esto no para, esto va incrementándose, tengo que trabajar de manera interdisciplinaria y tengo que generar investigación, indicadores, información que me permita poder hacer todo lo que ustedes me están pidiendo, porque es muy fácil decirle a alguien, perfílenme lo que les enseñé en la tarde. Perfiles, usted criminóloga, victimóloga, está estudiando psicología, sí. Pero si no tengo información, ¿cómo quiere que haga? Necesito información de la víctima, de las averiguaciones previas, necesito varias cosas que usted no tiene. ¿Cómo la hago? ¿Cómo puedo? ¿Sí? Pero ¿qué es que necesito yo? Información. Tengo que ver la parte económica de las víctimas, las leyes procesales que tengan no solamente la protección a la víctima, sino la perspectiva de género. También, ¿cómo va a ejercer la víctima todos sus derechos? ¿Cómo voy a decirle yo a qué tiene derecho en cuanto a su reparación del daño y al caso en específico? Proteger la seguridad de las víctimas, lo que decía la compañera en la mañana. Las medidas de protección, las órdenes de protección, las órdenes de alejamiento, las órdenes de restricción, porque cada estado cambia la denominación, son actos procesales muy específicos que juezas y jueces y agentes del Ministerio Público y Policía no saben utilizar o implementar. Entonces, no las implementan. De una estadística que hubo en tribunales del Distrito Federal, nos dicen que no las implementan, una, porque no las conocen, o dos, porque las consideran violatorias del principio de igualdad y de los derechos de la persona que está siendo investigada, que normalmente es hombre. Entonces dicen, es una discriminación. No, porque la ley nos faculta para eso y aparte es una acción afirmativa. Y recuerden que aquí hay un interés muy importante. Estamos hablando de bienes jurídicos como es la vida, la integridad física de mujeres y de niños. Si yo no hago eso, pasa como en muchos lugares. Ustedes escucharon en Jalisco el caso Iris. ¿Cuál es el caso Iris? Estuve trabajando en Jalisco por parte de la PGR con el grupo de la Procuraduría y de Periciales. Es el caso en donde una señora va a hacer la denuncia, pasa por 7, 8 instancias del Estado, DIF, tribunales, familiares, penales, pasa por todas las áreas de mediación y todo, y sucede que llegan a un área de mediación en donde le dice la persona que estaba mediando, es que usted puede perder la guardia y custodia de los niños. Y le pregunta el señor, ¿qué es eso? Se los van a quitar. Ese mismo día, el señor con pistola en mano llega a la casa de la señora que estaba embarazada, estaba con su suegra y otros familiares de ella, les dispara ahí a toda la familia. Total que mueren 2 de sus familiares, mata a su suegra también, y la mujer afortunadamente se salvó, el bebé también se salvó, y él termina suicidándose. Entonces digo, pasó por 8 instancias, ¿qué pasó? ¿No? Debió de haber funcionado. Y esto implica que no estamos haciendo bien nuestro trabajo con las víctimas. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí los errores no se pagan con perder el caso. Aquí un error puede pagar la mujer con la vida, toda la familia. Miren, ¿qué nos pasa no solamente en México? Leí una noticia de Estados Unidos en donde decían, y le preguntaron a un criminólogo en Estados Unidos, oiga, dice, es preocupante que en 4 días hayan matado a 4 familias de manera muy brutal y sangrienta en Estados Unidos, pero seguidas, familias completas. Y el criminólogo responde, como especialista y científico, bueno, sí, es que eso es normal, no es de sorprenderse, porque en Estados Unidos vive una ola de violencia muy fuerte y todo eso. Perdón, pero yo que sí me dedico a esto, 4 incidentes en donde me maten familias completas, es de preocuparse. ¿Por qué? Porque primero yo como criminóloga, como criminólogo, si estoy viendo eso como normal, yo ya estoy mal, ¿sí? Porque eso no es normal. Eso, estadísticamente, si yo llevo mi estadística, tengo que hacer proyecciones. En el 2008 fui a El Salvador a hacer proyecciones, y mi proyección fue en homicidios, que cuando llegáramos en México a los 100 homicidios por el indicador de violencia relacionada con delincuencia organizada, estábamos en un estado de anomia. Y permítanme decirles que esa proyección que hice en el 2008 la hemos sobrepasado, porque ustedes saben que ha habido estados de la República que en un día han aparecido fosas de 250 personas. Y las autoridades comentan, no, pero estadísticamente no se preocupe, las han matado en diferentes fechas. Claro que me preocupo, porque en un día que me aparezcan 250 cuerpos, 300 o 40 cuerpos tirados o 50 en un periférico, claro que es de preocuparme. Si usted como autoridad no le preocupa, yo llevo toda la estadística desde 1830 a la fecha en materia de homicidios, para decir y pensar como estoy pensando. Pero ¿qué necesitamos muchas veces? Que pasen cosas muy extraordinarias. ¿Y qué son extraordinarias? Que tiren bombas, ¿no? Que desoyen gente, que hagan atrocidad y media, y estamos perdiendo esa capacidad. En el área donde yo trabajo una parte teórica, yo trabajo desde hace 23 años, bueno, y también a la par fuera de la institución. Trabajo en el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM, en la Unidad de Documentación, Legislación y Jurisprudencia. Eso me ha permitido, como les decía, tener un espacio distinto de análisis. No hay violencia, todo el mundo es cordial, aparentemente, ¿cierto? Hay otro ambiente. Entonces, cuando yo llego, dicen, ¿y cómo te dedicas a homicidios, a feminicidios? Pues porque no estoy todo el tiempo ahí, y eso me permite ver las cosas de diferente manera, sentir las cosas de diferente manera. Y cuando yo llego a los grupos que ya están muy acostumbrados a esto, le digo, ¿y por qué no es esto? Mira, ya hay un pelo. Dice, ¿cuál pelo? Le dije, un pelo ahí en la cama. Dicen, hasta los mismos peritos cuando hemos hecho los análisis de lugares de hechos, de lugares de hallazgo. Yo le digo, es que estamos tan acostumbradas y acostumbrados a ver diario lo mismo que ya perdemos esa capacidad de ver otras cosas. Entonces, todo este diagnóstico, que es muy extenso, nos habla de las diferentes formas en que hay que actuar procesalmente y a nivel dogmático con las víctimas. Pero lo más importante es que no mencionan de manera contundente lo que es el personal especializado. Y vuelvo a decirles, esto no se atiende solo. Yo le puedo decir a la víctima, llegue, denuncia, o al niño, a la niña, juega con la computadora, que hay un osito virtual y todo, yo estoy aquí atrás y todo, un títere. ¿Para qué? Para que denuncies violencia sexual, sí, pero atrás de todo eso, atrás de la tecnología, de la información y las comunicaciones, todo lo que yo utilice, eso no me va a sustituir a mí como ser humano, como persona. Y eso es lo que muchas veces nuestras autoridades piensan que podemos hacer. Dicen, no, las denuncias, todo cibernético, no te preocupes, eso simplificamos y todo por internet y todo. Le digo, sí, pero pierdo el contacto con la gente. Yo necesito que esa persona sepa que yo estoy ahí, ¿sí? Y en algún momento que voy a estar para servirle. No, por la computadora dije, la puedo dejar prendida y yo ni estoy. Y al siguiente día veo los recados si es que me dejó, ¿sí?
A lo mejor como un primer contacto.
Sí, como un primer contacto, sí.
Porque muchas veces no tienen tanta confianza, ¿no? Como que se vuelven incluso adeptos a compartir, a la convivencia con las personas. Como que yo he percatado de una persona que sufre violencia y ella ya se aisló. O sea, ya se aisló, no quiere platicar ni nada. Entonces, es muy difícil, pero estos medios nos ayudan a establecer unos contactos.
Sobre todo por lo que les dijo Regina de aspectos psicológicos, debemos de establecer empatía, establecer rapport, establecer un ambiente, ¿cómo decirles?, de tranquilidad, en donde yo atiendo prácticamente, bueno, porque luego me llega de todo, porque también luego me dedico a cuestiones de protección a los animales, ¿sí? Entonces me llegan desde, oiga usted es tenebroso, sí, le traemos esto. ¿Qué es esto? Son 3 gatos. Y dije, sí, bueno, y dice, para que les consiga casa, le digo, sí, pero, a ver, bueno, ya dije, denme los gatos. Entonces, eso es atenderlo, porque le puedo decir, no, y los gatos los van a tirar o los van a ahogar, ¿sí? Entonces, cuando me llegan las cosas, claro, me dicen, no, es que en mi institución me llaman mucho veces la atención por eso. Dicen, es que tu trabajo es sí, pero dije, pero si llega una persona con una problemática, trae una violencia feminicida, ¿qué hago? Pues me voy a tener que ir un poquito más tarde, no es mi función. Y no le voy a decir, váyase al jurídico de la UNAM, ¿por qué? Porque sé que muchas veces no establecen estos protocolos en el momento. Digo, ¿me permiten? Le enlazo con las personas que tengo que hacer, hago las redes, trabajo social, psicología, y ya van de mi parte, van con él, con esta persona, va usted, le da este salvoconducto y ya llega usted de mi parte con esta persona. Dicen, vamos a denunciar, vamos a hacer lo que se tenga que hacer. Pero, dije, y esta es la clave de contacto que vamos a tener para protegernos, tanto usted como yo. Y no hablo desde mi teléfono ni desde usted, yo voy a tener la forma de comunicación. ¿Y por qué necesito muchas veces establecer estos protocolos? Miren, como ustedes lo vieron en alienación parental, estas personas que ejercen este tipo de violencia traen ciertas características de personalidad muy fuertes. Si algo les estorba, lo eliminan. Si son personas vinculadas con delincuencia organizada, para que les cuente, ¿sí? De menos me mandan dar una tranquiza. En el primer caso, yo que manejé, que fue el caso de mi amiga. Yo iba en segundo semestre de la carrera, a la persona que la privó de la vida, que era su novio, lo sentenciaron a 28 años, él ya salió porque era primo delincuente, pero me acuerdo mucho porque tenía miedo, porque él quería saber quién era yo, porque en ese tiempo, cuando estaba muy activa en ayudarles a los abogados que llevaban el caso y todo, y él se obsesionó conmigo en ese aspecto de por tu culpa y me voy sobre ti y todo eso. Entonces sí tuve que establecer protocolos, o sea, no sabía nada en ese tiempo de todo esto, y a partir de ahí empecé a establecer protocolos de seguridad. ¿Por qué? Porque le digo, soy valiente pero no soy mártir, ¿sí? Entonces en algún momento yo tengo que cuidar, para poder dar una buena atención tengo que cuidarme yo, pero también a mi familia, porque mi familia no tiene nada que ver. Mi familia se vino enterando en que me especializaba el día de mi examen doctoral. Entonces me dijo mi mamá y mi papá, dice, oye, así como llevar una doble vida, ¿no? Dice, ay, ¿a poco te dedicas a homicidio? Le dije, sí, papá. Dice, ay, nunca te habíamos visto, es que como nunca platicas, nunca te ven. Le dije, sí, mamá, y así tiene que ser. Así tiene que ser, porque ustedes y es que te fuiste 2 años, dijo, ya le dije al Estado de la República al que estuve trabajando los feminicidios, dice, pero ahí estaban matando, yo ya las noticias que estaban desapareciendo, mujeres, sí, mamá, por eso no podía, porque usted no iba a poder dormir y me iba a estar hablando cada rato y pues me podían localizar, o la podían localizar. Entonces, todo eso, que muchas veces a mí no me gusta aparecer en medios, hay abogados que les gustan mucho los medios, a mí no me sirven, ¿por qué? Porque no necesito que sepan quién soy ni qué hago. Sí, porque además el factor sorpresa en esto es muy importante. ¿Qué buscamos nosotros con esto? Bueno, tratamos siempre de prevenir conductas tan graves como el feminicidio. Y esto porque ya tenemos una sentencia del 2009 que tiene que ver con el delito de feminicidio de la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Ya cumplimos este próximo 16, 4 años, en donde, ¿qué nos dice un feminicidio? Miren, y por eso les decía que nos vamos con esa idea a nivel forense y a nivel cultural. ¿Qué nos marcan los relatores de Naciones Unidas que vinieron a ver este tema? Nos dicen que indicaron que aun cuando no siempre se tiene toda la información disponible de este tipo, existen indicadores tales como mutilaciones de ciertas partes del cuerpo, ausencia de pechos o genitales para saber que estamos ante un feminicidio. Y les puedo decir que tenemos casos en donde los cuerpos están intactos, pero que sí existe todo el antecedente de violencia de género y eso lo convierte en un feminicidio, aunque no le corten nada, aunque no aparentemente haya nada de exactamente violencia física en el cuerpo. Y fíjense esta parte, esta mujer de esta que ya falleció fue la presidenta municipal de Tiquicheo en Michoacán. Se salvó varias veces hasta que la última vez sí ya la levantaron y bueno, la mató la delincuencia organizada y en Michoacán. Entonces, muchas veces es esta parte, como yo les digo siempre a las personas que nos dedicamos a esto, nunca hay que dar las cosas por hecho, nunca hay que subestimar a las personas, nunca hay que confiarnos. No les digo que vamos a vivir siempre con miedo ni nada, pero hay ciertas cuestiones de seguridad que nosotros debemos de cuidar. Entonces, en algún momento, es una de las cosas que tenemos como importantes. ¿Cómo se tipifica el feminicidio? Bueno, a nivel federal ya lo tenemos también tipificado. ¿Y qué implica el feminicidio? Por ejemplo, que tomamos mucho del Distrito Federal, que comete el delito de feminicidio por razones de género cuando se dan las siguientes circunstancias: signos de violencia sexual de cualquier tipo, que la víctima le hayan infligido lesiones, mutilaciones infamantes o degradantes previas o posteriores a la privación de la vida o actos de necrofilia, que existan antecedentes o datos de cualquier tipo de violencia en ámbito familiar, laboral, escolar, sujeto activo y en contra de la víctima, que haya existido entre el activo y la víctima una relación sentimental, afectiva, de confianza, que existan datos que establezcan que hubo amenazas relacionadas con el hecho delictuoso, acoso, lesiones del sujeto activo sobre la víctima, que haya sido incomunicada, cualquiera que sea el tipo previo a la privación de la vida, el cuerpo de la víctima sea expuesto o exhibido en lugar público y a quien cometa el delito de feminicidio se impondrán de 40 a 60 años de prisión y de 500 a 1000 días de multa. Además de las sanciones descritas, el sujeto activo perderá todos los derechos relacionados con la víctima, incluidos los de carácter sucesorio. En el caso que no se acredite el feminicidio, se aplicarán las reglas de homicidio. Al servidor público que retarde, entorpezca maliciosamente o por negligencia la procuración o administración de justicia, se le impondrán penas de prisión de 3 a 8 años y de 500 a 1500 días de multa. Además será destituido o inhabilitado de 3 a 10 años para desempeñar otro empleo, cargo o comisión pública. ¿Y qué dice su Código Penal? ¿Sí? Su Código Penal nos dice que en el delito de homicidio, el homicidio doloso de mujeres se considera feminicidio cuando se actualice alguna de las siguientes circunstancias: por razones de violencia de género, entendiéndose estas como la privación de la vida asociada a la exclusión, subordinación, discriminación o explotación del sujeto pasivo. Se cometa en contra de persona con quien se haya tenido una relación sentimental, afectivo, de confianza, que haya estado vinculada con el sujeto activo por relación de hecho en su centro de trabajo, institución educativa o por razones de carácter técnico profesional, y exista con antelación conductas que hayan menoscabado, anulado sus derechos o atentado contra la dignidad del pasivo. El sujeto activo habrá ejecutado conductas sexuales, crueles o degradantes o mutile al pasivo o el cuerpo del pasivo. Y se dan cuenta el lenguaje de género, es mujer. ¿Sí se dan cuenta de eso? Es mujer. Y en estos temas tiene que ser en femenino, en mujer, en una teoría feminista. ¿Por qué? Porque es teoría de género, pero también es feminismo. Pero a veces da miedo, ¿por qué? Porque empiezan a descalificar la parte de discriminación. Y bueno, es que el tema lo amerita, los indicadores lo ameritan, y yo necesito generar ese indicador. Que exista con antelación actos que constituyan violencia familiar del sujeto activo hacia el pasivo, o en los casos a que se refiere este artículo, la penalidad será de 40 a 70 años de prisión y de 700 a 5000 días de multa. ¿Sí se dan cuenta? O sea, agravamos la punibilidad, pero eso no nos deja que también muchas veces trabajemos otras cosas que tengan que complementar. Del último diagnóstico del año pasado del INEGI, ¿qué nos dice? Homicidios por entidad federativa. Vean cuántos homicidios tuvimos. Estadísticamente tenemos un 99% de impunidad en homicidios a nivel nacional. Hombres y mujeres. Hay más homicidios de hombres que mujeres, ¿ok? Estadísticamente desde 1830 a la fecha. Pero también hay, en mujeres tenemos subregistros. Cuando yo iniciaba en esto, cuando fui al servicio médico forense para ver las estadísticas, estaba haciendo mi tesis, 21 años, me acuerdo lo que me dijo el director del servicio médico forense en el Distrito Federal. Le dije, oiga, ¿por qué muchas mujeres mueren en su casa? ¿Saben qué me contestó? Dice, bueno, es que las mujeres son muy tontas, son muy distraídas, dice, pues se caen, se resbalan, pues no tienen cuidado. Y en ese tiempo me pasó lo que la niña en la película que les mostré al inicio. Me quedé viendo al techo y me quedé pensando, dije, pues me lo está diciendo el director del servicio médico forense, pero no me suena lógico. Debe de haber otra explicación, pero hasta ahí me quedé. Después de 23 años entiendo cuál es esa explicación, ¿ok? Que es la visión que él tiene, que no tiene perspectiva de género, ya hasta falleció el doctor. Pero vean esta parte también interesante. Homicidios y las causas de defunción en mujeres y en hombres. Vean. Agresión por ahorcamiento, estrangulamiento y sofocación. Formas no especificadas, agresión con objetos cortantes y arma de fuego. ¿Sí? ¿Nos damos cuenta? Ok, porque vamos a ver un diagnóstico específico también. Feminicidios en el Estado de México, según la Comisión Especial de Seguimiento de los Feminicidios de la Cámara de Diputados, la 61 legislatura, y mujeres, ONU Mujeres, el INEGI, el CONAPO, y también la CONAPO, perdón, y lo que es el Colegio de México. Vean las estadísticas de feminicidio en su estado. Esto también se los voy a proporcionar, y ahí viene por municipio, y bueno, viene desagregado todo. Vean los municipios en donde tuvieron más defunciones, 2005-2009. ¿Sí nos damos cuenta? Vean en dónde los tienen más elevados. Nosotros los feminicidios más elevados los tenemos en la delegación de Iztapalapa, ¿sí? Es el lugar y el foco rojo para nosotros que está en la zona norte. Y es uno de los lugares constantes que sigue teniendo esta estadística de feminicidios. Vean esta parte, ¿sí? Aquí vienen los casos. Esto lo tienen a color y todo lo van a tener en PDF. Vean. Fuentes. Características de las defunciones femeninas. Certificado del médico legista. Las necropsias que se hicieron. Casos que tienen que ver con violencia familiar. Lesiones en vía pública y en vivienda. Las edades de las víctimas. Pero permítanme, vamos a seguir mirando. Ahí está. Distribución de las defunciones con presunción de homicidios. Las formas que tienen de privar de la vida a las mujeres según la estadística de los servicios médicos forenses de su entidad federativa. ¿Cómo matan más a las mujeres? Según esta estadística, vean. Ahorcamientos y armas de fuego. Es la forma más común que se tiene de privar a las mujeres. No solamente aquí, a nivel nacional. Esa es la forma en que tiene de privar a las mujeres y también por arma de fuego. Ahora, distribución de defunciones masculinas, ahí las tienen también para que las vean. ¿Cómo matan más a los hombres? Por arma de fuego. A pocos los ahorcan. La mayoría, pero sí se dan cuenta que eso también tiene que ver con una perspectiva de género. Hay un libro que hizo la Fundación DOC, los servicios de urgencias de Estados Unidos, que se los recomiendo, de editorial Elsevier, está en español, y está documentado a nivel forense las diferentes formas en que privan de la vida a las mujeres en Estados Unidos. Y una de las formas también que privan a las mujeres es por ahorcamiento. ¿Y qué es lo que hacen? La policía tiene en sus intervenciones un protocolo específico para ahorcamiento de mujeres. ¿Por qué? Porque eso pasa a medicina forense y también los médicos forenses tienen un protocolo específico para ahorcamiento y asfixias en mujeres. Ahora, ojo con esto también. Indicadores de violencia feminicida. ¿Cómo están las relaciones de estas mujeres? Vean por años. Mujeres unidas que sufrieron violencia sexual de pareja. Mujeres unidas que sufrieron violencia física de pareja. ¿Se dan cuenta en dónde la tenemos más alta? Lo morado es aquí. Lo morado es nacional, pero vean ustedes, esto es lo nacional, esto es de ustedes, mujeres solteras que sufrieron violencia comunitaria. Y aquí lo que decía la compañera, no tenemos protocolos, no tenemos formas forenses, todavía estamos construyendo homicidios violentos de mujeres. Vean cómo está elevado. ¿En dónde las privan de la vida? ¿En dónde creen ustedes que las privan de la vida? Con mayormente a las mujeres en nuestro país. ¿En qué lugar las matan? ¿Mande? No, ¿en qué lugares las matan físicamente? ¿En qué lugar la privan de la vida? En su casa. ¿Y en dónde más? Vía pública y en el hogar. Cuando estuvimos trabajando en una entidad federativa, se les empezaron a elevar las muertes de mujeres los fines de semana. Entonces el procurador estaba el staff del Estado, con el gobernador, y dijo, se nos están elevando las muertes de las mujeres en este estado, entonces vamos a estar dentro de los 10 primeros estados. ¿Qué vamos a hacer? Y se le ocurre decir al de Seguridad Pública y al de la Procuraduría, toque de queda para las mujeres. Entonces se oye un no de todo el staff de las mujeres. Oigan, dice, ahora nos van a encerrar. Pues si ven la estadística, ¿dónde las están matando? En su casa. Entonces, les va a subir ahora. Sí, dice, pero ¿qué hacemos? Es que se van a tomar y miren a las niñas, bueno, no les pasa nada malo, recuerden esto, ¿no? Y decían, hasta la integrante del Instituto Especializado de Mujeres en estos temas, dijo, oiga, dices que yo todos los fines de semana es el único día que salgo, pues echarme unas copiosas, ¿no? Dice, ponerme alegre. O sea, ¿me va a quitar esto por el toque de queda? Pues sí. Dijo, no, y además se restringen derechos en ese afán de te voy a cuidar, espérate, yo te cuido. Pues sí, pero ¿de qué manera me estás cuidando? Ahora, fíjense el diagnóstico y niveles y tendencias que salió de su estado, en este estudio especializado. El Estado de México se ha caracterizado por presentar las tasas de defunciones femeninas con presunción de homicidio más altas del país. Ocupó el primer sitio nacional del 88 al 97, bajó un puesto en el 98 y otro en el 99, para volver al primer lugar en el 2000, 2003 y 2005. En este último año se dio una gran reducción de las tasas, un 28% y todavía más al año siguiente de casi un tercio. El 2007 fue el año de menor tasa de asesinatos de mujeres en el Estado de México, como el conjunto del país de 2.65, 2.2 por cada 100.000 mujeres respectivamente. Si tomamos como punto de referencia los niveles observados en el 85, la tasa del Estado de México representa el 31% del inicial, en tanto que en la nación se redujo en un 48%, es decir, los avances en esta entidad fueron mucho mayores que en la media del país en adelante. El Estado de México se acerca cada vez más al promedio nacional. Los asesinatos de mujeres crecieron un 38% en los últimos 2 años estudiados, contra el 68.2 en el ámbito nacional, para alcanzar una tasa de 3.7 cercana ya a la nacional de 3.4, lo que lo ubica en la entidad en el 9º lugar del país, o sea, está ahí, según este diagnóstico, en el ranking, dentro de los 10 primeros.